Thank you. Hi, my name's Mark. The day that I received confirmation that I was accepted to this workshop was the day that Trump won the election. And as we speak, he's preparing to take his oath of office. I saw a pop-up that says a state of emergency has just been declared in the Mexican border. So this project is being delivered into a new landscape with new valences than it was conceived in. So that's very interesting. What a time to be studying religion. So the idea for this paper was sparked in July when Donald Trump encouraged Christians to vote on the grounds that he would abolish voting on the next election. He says, you won't have to vote again or any more, my beautiful Christians. Just vote this once, I'll fix it, and you won't have to vote again. So I grew up as a Quaker, and while I'm not approaching this project from a confessional point of view, it occurred to me that truth and democracy seemed core to my Christian practice. So this statement made me very curious about what's happening in the Christian right. 86% of those who identify as Christian nationalists, as a particular group of Christians, believe the last election was stolen compared to only 36% of the general population, 86 versus 36. And 73% of Christian nationalists say that they read and are interested in and subscribe to some extent to QAnon, a conspiracy that posits senior civil servants are a cabal of Satan worshippers. Despite, again, my experience being that Christians are generally supportive of and curious in institutions. So what's happening with Christian nationalists? In order to explore that, I'm going to take a whistle-stop tour through implicit religions. And I'm aware that some of you might know what this is, and some of you might not. But implicit religions is looking at how, rather than how religious studies is classically defined religion, which is comparing them to European Protestantism, which overemphasizes interior beliefs, the putative currency of religious studies, rather looking at religion relationally. The question here, is Christianity a religion? Is because Christianity might profess that its status as a religion is all about interior belief, and would self-define as being somebody who believes. However, there are any number of embodied, emplaced, performative material and relational activities that constitute Christianity, which is not reduced to internal faith. For example, the Eucharist. If Christianity is all about internal faith, what is this man doing with the wafer and the cup? Indeed, what happens on Sundays and what happens during any kind of Eucharistic eating? There is clearly, you might say, I have said in my notes, but you might disagree, elements of praxis that would fail at a definition of religion that only captures internal belief. And we can understand religion as a series of embedded and relational practices. Similarly, this might help us make sense of secularization and the changing role of Christianity in society. Because you could understand political institutions such as communism and democracy as operating like religions. To explain that statement, I'll introduce you to the global meanings model. The global meanings model suggests that religions are any core schema through which people interpret their experiences, taking on the form of an overarching cosmological story which provide an interpretive heuristic for the world. This aligns with Tillich's interpretation of faith as the ultimate concern of the ultimately concerned. Political systems such as liberal democracy make a compelling fit for a global meanings model of religion. The idea that democracy is so foundational wars might be fought over it or history defined by it fits the criteria of something with which people are ultimately concerned and which is interlinked with every area of life. This makes sense of Durkheim's psychological approach to religion, that nationalism and religion are so functionally similar that they are indistinguishable. Similarly, philosopher-historians Vogelheim and Kowalowski both suggest that communism operates as a religion in all but name, replacing traditional spiritual beliefs with secular alternatives, materialist dialectics, and teleological predeterminism of class structures, even having salvific narratives, such as salvation on earth through the revolution. Similarly, if you believe in liberal democracy like a religion, that can be summed up as a cosmology including individual agency, a baseline condition of human rights improved upon by progress through competition, and an emergent and open-ended history. But this is somewhat complicated. Communism suppressed religion, and liberal democracy allows religious structures to continue to exist alongside the state. How do we account for these interactions? And similarly, if you subscribe to the secularization narrative, how would you make sense of the decline of religion coinciding with there still being religious institutions exercising power in the world? This comes back to the global meanings model, and I've provided an illustration here from Bruno Latour of multiple attractors drawing us towards different nodes. So while democracy is a top-level story of being, which creates complex modalities through interacting with religion, it does not supplant religion as the global meanings model. Rather, they exist in a landscape where one can be attracted to multiple meanings models, a pick and mix, you might say, or a sliding scale. So we exist around multiple global meanings with multiple attractors, and we navigate our sense of self and all those global problems and questions of self between these. To think about this, we could think about the civil rights movement. Who can tell me who this is?
I think you meant these.
Oh, no. Oh, you missed the picture as well. That's what I mean by the multiple attractors, which I was looking at while I spoke. Who can tell me who this is? A bunch of mumbles. Very good. Say it proud. Dr. King, a very important figure of the civil rights movement in America. He said, the denial of a sacred right to vote is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition and the principles of our Christian faith. The mandates of a democratic tradition and the principles of our Christian faith. Just as the Apostle Paul left his village to carry the gospel of Jesus to the far corners of the world, I am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom, meaning the freedom to vote. It's clear that for King and his movement, democracy and Christianity are compatible. This theological view helped establish all humans have inherent dignity regardless of their social status. It took some time to ferment into a political view from its biblical origins, but it's clear that there is substantial overlap in the global meanings that these provide, that the Christianity of Martin Luther King is, in his view, fitting hand in glove with the values of a liberal democracy. Similarly, this is William Barber II, professor in public theology at Yale and former board member of the NAACP, so he's a big person in civil rights. He says the vote is a form of prayer in a democratic process. When we vote, we're not just choosing a candidate, we're choosing to believe in the possibility of democracy. Votes are a kind of prayer. So interestingly, the approach here is to reform, but ultimately trust in democratic institutions. There's a long history of Christian thought about this in America. But Trump, the putatively evangelical candidate, is campaigning to a religious audience against voting and with high amounts of skepticism about institutions. So what's up with that? How did that happen? A study by Miller highlights that white evangelical voters, a group typically seen as value-driven in the USA, voted en masse for Trump in 2016, despite Trump giving virtually no evidence of the religious belief or personal morality traits that you would expect evangelicals to be motivated by. Miller suggests this is due to a transition from values-led voting to contextualizing those values in a complex backdrop of shared identification and recognition among fellow nationalists, leading to identity-led voting. Indeed, Make America Great Again has some of the hallmarks of a global meaning model. It has moral stakes, instructions on how to act and behave, guidance through crisis moments, and a salvation narrative, salvation through nationalism. A piece of research that polled 540 members of the religious right identified that members of this group report low level of personal religiosity, low levels of prayer, low levels of church attendance. But does this mean that they are not really properly religious? No. Because we already established religion can be just as much about relationality and praxis as it is about internal belief. Again, in this survey, these people saw that their political action was taking the form of an external expression of religious belief. So voting for Trump was a form of praxis. There are challenging consequences for this. Since politics and religion are doing the same work from the perspective of implicit religions, it might be impossible to separate out the Make America Great Again political movement from the new Christian moralities that are emerging onside it. This reinforces the view earlier that the operationalization of religion cannot be reduced down to the private and individual. Indeed, Christian nationalism must be fully situated in the political context for us to make sense of their praxis. Here's the attractors again. So I would suggest that an asymmetry of where people get their news from isolates members of the Christian nationalism right from the mainstream discourse. They encounter new discourse which crowds out other global meanings of both Christianity and nationalism and fosters this new formation of identity. This is the complex backdrop of shared identification and recognition among fellow group members that Miller was talking about. This is a well-meaning American trying to figure out what his religion is amongst all these attractors. Here we see the dark mirror of the religious theoretical origins of social movements explored earlier in the context of the civil rights movement. American Christian nationalism is implicitly structured as an ethno-cultural political identity and follows racial and gender hierarchies which also claim legitimacy by harking back to an ancient Christian moral regime. This fits the criteria of a religion and could be best understood as an implicit religion rather than a traditional religion. And we should expect this new Christian nationalism to have all the heuristic power, including the staying power of any other faith. It could be called a civil religion, the putative secular nation state, a model of implicit religions. It could also maybe be understood as an NRM, but I'm not the expert on that. The experts are in the room here. I would say that we should take this seriously. We mentioned the algorithm earlier, and maybe we saw Trump's TikTok stunt this morning where he got the purveyors of the platform to take it down just so we could bring it back a day later. The algorithm is not a neutral thing. It's a very powerful piece of information control, which is controlled by very few people, and it's a very big part of what controls how people move through this religious landscape. So to summarize, I'll take away key points. Religions and politics do the same work from the perspective of implicit religions. Number two, religious and political cosmologies can be felt as concurrent attractors at the same time as each other under a global meanings model. Three, value voters can find their values are crowded out by other global meanings that constitute the identity, such as we saw with Christians in the New Christian Right, becoming identity-based rather than values-based. And four, civil religion discourse could be fruitful when discussing MAGA and the new Christian nationalism. That's the final slide. And I don't find it useful to include references, but you can grab my email at the bottom there for my references. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I brought something interesting for those who are not too familiar with religious studies. I recognize that I am looking to provide tools to contextualize and understand religious ontologies, which, again, I hope is a balanced part of a balanced diet here at this panel today. In terms of Tillich, I think you could make the argument that there are internal and external manifestations of having an ultimate belief. My intention there is to disabuse us of the notion that the only meaningful currency of religion is solely internal belief. It seems evident to me that you can have manifestations of a highest priority that are almost entirely external. In terms of disambiguating the phrase Christianity, stripped from the 10-minute version of the paper, but I can tell you now, 63% evangelical Protestant, 10% mainline Protestant, 18% Catholic, 2.5% Mormon, 0% other religion, and there's no mention of Jehovah's Witnesses here, although this data is 4 or 5 years old, so I imagine that has changed. So in terms of social media and getting rid of fact checkers, I think that you will all be quite familiar about like disinformation spirals and going down the rabbit hole and whatever else. But something that's interesting to me here is the concept of doctrinal tiers and how radicalization and orthodoxy can happen in Christian groups. So if you're not familiar with that, you can have 1, 2, 3 tiers of belief. Tier 1 would be something that is core, the dark umbra of your belief, and you can't change that. So in Christianity, you could say that like belief in Jesus, that could be a tier 1 belief for you. And if that was not present in your religion, you have to leave the religion. Tier 2 is something you might leave the church over, but it's not foundational to the religion. So gay marriage is a great example of a tier 2 belief, that some people might go to a different church and more aligned with their view. And tier 3 belief would be something that you might disagree with your neighbor on, but you could talk about it and not have a big falling out. So like whether people should take communion if they are not baptized, something like that. Something that doesn't seem like a part of that dark umbra, but it's on the penumbra of belief. Something that I think we observe that's being done very effectively is moving those beliefs up a tier. So making gay marriage into a tier 1 belief that you should leave your church if they don't align with you on this issue. I guess it's unclear to me what the future of that will be, but it'll be interesting for us scholars, right? Because if your neighbors have access to some material on TikTok and there are like regular pastors trying to use those new media technologies. But I think that a real defining feature of the information landscape is that the left wing is adhering to the traditional media and the right wing is deploying new media. So if people in your community have engaged with new media and find themselves radicalized up the doctrinal tier, and they won't break bread with you anymore over something that was once a penumbral issue and is now at the dark umbra of faith, are you even doing the same religion anymore? Like, how are you associating with those people? So an interesting time anthropologically as that proceeds at pace. Thank you for your thoughtful comments.